The best parts about the Presidio of San Francisco, and one of the hardest parts as well, is how many important events and people have come through this place. Sometimes we wish we had like Gettysburg, 3 days, one
Mm.
place, really one story with a set of sub stories. But we really do have um, all the major players in Spanish colonial history in San Francisco come through the Presidio of San Francisco.
So, and it really is that being able to go back there and sort of walk through those layers and come to the very end of that room where you can see the wall, where you could see there's a depiction of a native person there, et cetera. It's really exciting. It's beautiful to be able to do. And that's the Officers Club of the U.S. Army base that it became, right? So what was the evolution of Spanish Presidio, Mexican Presidio, and U.S. Army installation?
Well, like Kari was saying, that 1835 date was a watershed moment in terms of opening the door of Mexican California to the arrival of Americans over the next 15 years. And the skeleton crew that was here at the Presidio in the mid 1840s fell very quickly to the arrival of the American military in 1846, which opened up the American period of the Presidio's history. And, I always like to point out to visitors today when they come here, what they're seeing is the American Presidio. It is, covered in forest, like Kari was describing, which was introduced in the 1880s by the U.S. Army. 95% of the buildings that stand here are from the American period, really from principally the 1860s up to the 1980s. And so what you're looking at when you visit the Presidio today is an American military post and a highly manipulated landscape, which is exactly why the Presidio is recognized as a National Historic Landmark District, because that history over that long period of American occupation has altered it so significantly, not just in relation to its original, ecological or even Spanish period character, but also in relationship to the city around it. So that's why the Presidio stands out as much as it does today as a special place.
So if I were to arrive at the Presidio in 1848, 1849, what do you think I would see?
Still pretty windswept, sandy, like Kari was describing. We have early American accounts that complain of the cold and the damp and the wind and the sand, and that's something we still experience here today when we're in the park. We can actually hear the foghorns blowing out on the bay right now. But what the Americans set about to do was to address that and shape the Presidio really in their own image. And by that, I mean primarily the perspective of an East Coast, American military person, probably of Northern European descent. So that's where the idea of the trees comes in as a way to Americanize the landscape of the Presidio, make it a forested, a green space. Those trees, of course, were introduced not just from other parts of California, but eucalyptus was brought from Australia. So it's this really interesting hybridized, colonized ecological landscape as well. And then the architectural styles that were brought here, starting in the period you just mentioned, represent the unfolding of American architectural history in California over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So we have some early examples of Victorian architecture here. We have some, for the Army anyway, high Victorian style residential buildings. We have some what we refer to as colonial revival masonry buildings, like the one we're in right now, which is 1896 enlisted men's barracks that would look perfectly at home at Fort Benning, Georgia or something. on up into the eventual adoption of Spanish colonial revival and mission revival style architecture that the U.S. Army wound up embracing in the first few decades of the 20th century as they started to reflect upon their relationship with California's Spanish and Mexican heritage and how that was viewed in the contemporary time period, which is to say the early 20th century. So this is really an encyclopedia of American military architecture and American architecture in general, and it's really just a marvel to work with.
So the Spanish revival architecture there, did that coincide with the World's Fair, the exhibition, et cetera, and building things like the Palace of Fine Arts?
Yes, exactly. The introduction of Spanish colonial style revival architecture here is generally pegged to the creation of Fort Winfield Scott, which is a subpost of the Presidio that still exists. It was primarily developed between 1909 and 1912, so that does coincide with the World's Fairs you just mentioned, and then the Pan-Pacific International Expo a few years later. That really was where the that style of architecture landed here and was ultimately adopted as the predominant architectural style in the Presidio. So that's when you even see the Army starting to adapt some of its earlier 19th century buildings to look more Spanish. So they would paint red brick buildings white. They'd put Spanish style roofs on something that would have had a wood shingle roof. So there was a very conscientious and very deliberate plan on the part of the U.S. Army to make the buildings here cohesive, to embrace and reflect the long and international character of the Presidio, which was something the U.S. Army was very proud of and very much adopted as part of their identity here.
So that's really interesting. I wanted to go backwards a little bit and ask you about something that goes back to the Spanish period. I know that there was a fortress or a fort up on the hill above where Fort Point is today that was called Castillo de San Joaquín, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that was and what happened to it?
So the Castillo de San Joaquín actually is a very interesting history. So I'll take you even further back. That's where, when Anza came up with his original party, the original 240 or so people in his recon 250 years ago, that's where he wanted to put the fort at what we call the Cantil Blanco, the White Bluffs. And when Moraga came back with the actual settlers, they thought differently.
Moraga was
that's a little exposed.
Moraga was his second in command.
What's that?
Moraga was his second in command, right?
Moraga was his second in command, and then he left him in charge of the establishment of the Presidio of San Francisco. So then he became in command and decided to move the Presidio to where the Officers Club is today, so a slightly more protected location. But the Castillo becomes fortified after the visit of Vancouver to the San Francisco Bay. And that's where our map comes from. I mentioned we have one map of the Presidio, and that's our commander at the time, Commander Sal, saying, look, my fort only has 3 walls. And he signs it, all of this is notorious. And so I sign, because he knows Vancouver is coming, and Vancouver is going to see the state of affairs at the Presidio of San Francisco.
I'm sorry, so, Vancouver is?
Vancouver is, George Vancouver is a British captain who is sailing through San Francisco on his way to Alaska to do some negotiations about colonialism, basically. And so he's they know he's coming. And so before this British captain comes into the San Francisco Bay, Sal wants to let his commanders know what the Presidio looks like. So after that visit, and after Vancouver is not impressed with the Presidio of San Francisco, he says it did not accord with the sumptuous manner in which we expected the Spaniards to live on this side of the globe. Also, that the Presidio looked more like a pound fit for cattle. And so he was not complimentary. And this is the way that Sal eventually got his appropriation of cannon that came up as Army surplus from Peru. So they came, and those cannon actually are still in, 6 of them are still in the Presidio of San Francisco in our exhibition. They flank the Officers Club. But those were the original cannon that fortified the Castillo de San Joaquín eventually. And that all came together around 1794.
And then that Castillo, how long did it last?
So it was fortified until the U.S. Army arrives. This is one of my favorite stories about the arrival of the U.S. Army. They spiked our cannon, even though there was nobody here. And then they ended up having to drill out those spikes. And there's 2 cannon on either side of the front of the Officers Club. And if you want to come and see, you can see one that has its spike drilled out, and you can see one that's actually still spiked. It's one of my favorite artifacts of that very particular moment in U.S. history when in 1846. But eventually, the U.S. Army dynamites down the Cantil Blanco. So that bluff is actually destroyed in order to make way for Fort Point. And this is maybe where Rob is competent on the explanation of the way that fortification system worked.
Yeah, so Fort Point, which is still there today, famously
That's a really cool place.
underneath the south landing of the Golden Gate Bridge, was built beginning in the 1850s by the U.S. Army for the exact same reason that the Spanish built a fort there, although with a lot more muscle and firepower, which is still really evident in Fort Point today. I liken it to a medieval castle there on the northernmost promontory of San Francisco. It's really a evocative space. But that was, again, the U.S. Army doing just what the Spanish had done before them, which was to plant their flag, plant their major defensive firepower there at the mouth of the San Francisco Bay in order to claim it for the American enterprise. And it still stands there today.
When did they build Fort Point? Did they do that right after taking control of San Francisco, or I visited it a number of times, but I can't quite recall how soon that structure was built.
Early 1850s. So yes,
okay, so
right after
soon.
The Americans, effectively was one of the first things that they did. It predates many of the other buildings that still stand here at the Presidio. So it was clearly a priority project, and it's something that was built to last and still does.
Right. So the U.S. Army takes over the Presidio of San Francisco, 1847, builds Fort Point not too long afterwards. How did the Presidio then evolve in those years up until its eventual closure in the late 90s, mid 90s?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Presidio is a really a reflection of American military priorities of the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. So what you see in the Presidio today in our 800 buildings that remain from that period, scattered over our 1,500 acres here, are a reflection of the evolution of military technologies and military priorities. So, for example, we have an airfield, Crissy Field, which a lot of your listeners maybe have heard of as a place to go walk your dog or have some beautiful beach access. Was the first Army Air Corps airfield on the West Coast, established in 1921. There's still a handful of hangars down at Crissy Field that date to that period. We've rehabilitated several of them. So one now houses a indoor trampoline gym. Another aircraft maintenance facility houses a indoor swimming school where both my kids learned how to swim. So it's a really interesting place today that is directly connected to that point in the Presidio's history, the dawn of aviation technology. The other two other major functions that the Presidio drove forward during the American period were medical care. There were two major hospitals here at Letterman, what became Letterman General Hospital, established in the early 20th century. Ultimately, one of the most important American military medical care facilities on the West Coast throughout the 20th century, in particular in World War II, but up through the Vietnam War period, was a major medical care facility. And because why have one hospital when you can have two? We also had the Marine Hospital complex in the southwest part of the park. Now, this is something that was established as essentially a public health service for merchant marines, ultimately evolved into the public health service hospital system, which still exists, and there's public health service hospitals all over the country. We have a complex of those buildings which operated in a quasi-independent fashion from the rest of the Presidio. And the main hospital building down there is now a 150-unit apartment building that the Trust rehabilitated with a development partner about 15 years ago. And then the third major function here, in addition to just general Army administration and housing, was coast artillery defenses. So Fort Winfield Scott that I mentioned earlier, with the connection to the Spanish revival architecture, was established in the early 20th century as a Coast Artillery Corps headquarters. So all of the big concrete batteries that visitors still see throughout the Bay Area or up and down the coastline all over the country that were built in the 1890s and early 1900s, those were commanded from Fort Winfield Scott in the Presidio. And so the buildings that still stand from that were administrative buildings, barracks, housing for officers. It was essentially, again, an independent post within the Presidio that was responsible for maintaining those coast artillery batteries.
So the Presidio as a U.S. Army base, what roles did it play, say, in the big wars, Civil War, World War I, World War II, in its function as a base?
The Presidio has imprints from each of those conflicts. So one of the first big waves of development that we still see here today in the buildings that stand date to the Civil War. So we have an officers' row of residences and a hospital that were constructed in the 1860s, along with our chapel, that coincide with the American military buildup during the Civil War, because there was, some concern that San Francisco, due to its gold reserves, would be susceptible to Confederate attack from the sea. Another period that is reflected strongly here that I think a lot of Americans don't necessarily think about is the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century, where the U.S. was, for the first time, really asserting itself as a Pacific military power. And there were deployments sent out from Fort Mason, just another military installation here in San Francisco that's now part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, to the Philippines, across the Pacific. So the building that we're in right now, which is an 1890, mid 1890s enlisted men's barracks, was developed, really in response to the U.S. Imagining itself as a Pacific military power for the first time. And then World War I, there was a cantonment on what's now Crissy Field that was reflective of the American military buildup there. And then, of course, the big one, World War II, the Presidio played a major role in principally, strategic administrative deployment. Letterman Hospital that I mentioned was a major medical care facility for the Presidio. The point of embarkation, so the place where soldiers were sent into the Pacific Theater, was again at Fort Mason, not here at the Presidio, but just about everybody who was involved in World War II in the Pacific would have had some Presidio connection. And then, of course, the Cold War was a major point of activity here in the Presidio, which is interesting when you think about the relationship with the early Spanish Empire and the Russian Empire that was echoed throughout most of the second half of the 20th century, where Cold War technology development, the Nike missile program had a command post here. There is a Nike missile site here in the Presidio, and that really continued through the late 1980s. And then the big consequential decision that put us into the place where we are today occurred in 1989 when U.S. Congress, as part of the Base Realignment and Closure activity, the BRAC program, decided to close the Presidio.
How did it then become the park that it is today? Because I know there were lots of base closures around that time, and not all of them turned into such a wonderful facility and such a wonderful location.
Well, that's a great story. I'm glad we have an opportunity to tell it. So a few things fell into the Presidio's favor that put us on the path that we're on now. And one was a very consequential decision by the local Bay Area congressional delegation in the 1970s, which was to, in the legislation that created the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which is the larger national park unit that the Presidio is part of, along with Alcatraz, the Marin Headlands, Fort Funston, a lot of park properties that your listeners are probably familiar with. The legislation that created the GGNRA included a provision that if the Army ever left the Presidio, that the Presidio would be absorbed into the GGNRA as a national park site. And so when that decision was then made about 15 years later through the BRAC program, that is what set this process into motion of converting the military post into a park. And there's more to the story than that, because what really came to light, or really came into focus, I should say, after the Base Realignment and Closure Act decision in '89, the Army took about 5 years to wind down. So 1994, they marched out of the Lombard Gate for the last time. And the Park Service took over. But what the Park Service found was 6 million square feet of old buildings and a tremendous amount of infrastructure that was burdened with a huge and costly amount of deferred maintenance, run on a national park type budget. And so Congress then had to take another look at the arrangement that had been created, especially with account to the amount of money that was going to be needed to maintain and operate this place. And the decision that came out of that analysis was the creation of the Presidio Trust, which again is the agency that Kari and I work for and that operates 80% of the Presidio today. There's a invisible and administrative boundary whereby the National Park Service still manages the coastline of the Presidio. So Crissy Field, Baker Beach, and the other waterfront areas are Park Service, but the inland portions are the Presidio Trust responsibility. And it was set up that way because that 6 million square feet in the infrastructure I just described really needs to function more like a small town and less like a traditional national park. So Congress set us up in such a way that we would receive, like I mentioned earlier, 15 years of appropriations to act as seed money to bring the buildings back online, to address some of the critical infrastructure needs, and then gave the trust the flexibility to then lease out buildings to replace those appropriations with revenue that we generate through those leasing activities. And so today what that looks like is we bring in just under $200 million a year in leasing and other revenue streams, primarily through residential leasing program, the 3,000 people that I mentioned that rent housing from us. We have the commercial tenants that I mentioned earlier as well. And then we have a couple of other revenue streams related to things like parking fees. And we have a hospitality program that includes 2 hotels, a handful of restaurants, and of course, a golf course.
What are some of the more interesting more interesting attractions, tenants, buildings that are there right now that people might be interested in knowing about?
Well, it's hard to pick favorites because so many of them are just enormously successful rehabilitation projects. But to get you a sense of where we stand right now, so as I mentioned, there's 800 buildings in the park, 6 million square feet. About just over 550 of those contribute to the landmark designation. So we have some buildings that are considered non-historic from the later Army periods, but the vast majority of the buildings here are historic, and we rehabilitate and adaptively reuse them for new purposes in very creative and often innovative ways. So I mentioned to you that we have a handful of recreation buildings in the old Army Air Corps, buildings down on Crissy Field, which were a lot of fun to work with. How do you take a 1921 seaplane hangar, or I guess in that case that was an airplane hangar, and turn it into a trampoline gym that meets modern, seismic and safety accessibility codes. We have a lot of schools that have been incorporated into old Army administrative buildings. We just finished a fabulous project earlier this year where an 1864 Civil War era hospital has been rehabilitated as a K through 8 school. Very satisfying. The Letterman General Hospital that I mentioned to you earlier, portions of which the Army demolished about half of it, which is really sad, but the remaining half, the National Park Service in the early days of the trust was able to rehabilitate and turn into a multi-tenant office space for environmental nonprofits. And that still thrives as the Tide Center today. So there's a huge diversity of building types and building uses that we've really been fortunate to be able to get creative with, both in terms of how we plan for the rehabilitation projects, but then carry them out and tenant them. And our leasing programs have been really successful in the recent years. In particular, we're seeing very high 90s in our occupancy rates on our both commercial and residential sides, which is really great news for the income that we need to run this park as a world-class heritage site and public park.
So as we kind of close, because I want to respect your time, are there any interesting or famous people or events associated with the Presidio that it would be interesting to know about?
You want to start with the early days? I mean, Kari's already name dropped.
I know
the Spanish names associated with California. It's pretty impressive right there.
Yeah, one of the best parts about the Presidio of San Francisco, and one of the hardest parts as well, is how many important events and people have come through this place. Sometimes we wish we had like Gettysburg, right? 3 days, one place, one story with a set of sub stories. But we really do have all the major players in Spanish colonial history in San Francisco come through the Presidio of San Francisco. So, the Vallejos, the Sanchez's, the Arguellos, the Baragas. So it really is, like I said before, somewhat remarkable that from this one small place, there's this, major diaspora. And if you live in the Bay Area or most of California, the street names, the place names of all of these founders of Spanish colonialism really do have some connection to the Presidio of San Francisco. One of my favorite stories is when I was out on my archaeological site, was right in front of the Officers Club. We had descendants of two of the people that the street signs are named after, Graham and Moraga, right there at that street sign, right? These very important people, and here are their descendants here today. So there's a lot of people that can make a connection to this place just through the people that came through. Also, I will say that, we have a National Historic Landmark District that's eligible for lots of reasons, but we don't have an eligibility around people. Because maybe you can explain why that is. There's so many people who came through.
Yeah, Kari touched or encapsulated it really nicely, and it's both a challenge and an opportunity for us as we actively manage this place as a heritage site and present it to the visiting public. Which is, we don't have a Gettysburg moment, but we do have this centuries long continuous use and this never-ending list of people who have passed through here or have stayed here for a period of time and then gone on and done something else. There are a handful of really momentous moments here. One that if your listeners come in the next couple of weeks, they can come learn more about here in the Presidio, which is General DeWitt's decision to carry out the exclusion orders during World War II that impacted Japanese American communities up and down the West Coast. So that is one of those relatively rare, this moment in time, this, man's decision that then rippled out over many people's lives over a, really important part of our history. And listeners can come visit our Heritage Gallery to experience the exclusion exhibit that's open for just a couple more weeks. But again, the history of the Presidio is really one of continuity and one of gradual change over time that encapsulates the entire story of California, of the West Coast, of how the United States developed in this part of the country. And this is really one of those places that you can come see that for yourself. You can touch it with the Canon and the Adobe that Kari described and really soak it in, all while having a really good time and checking out our great views and other public amenities.
Well, excuse me. Well, I really want to thank you. The Presidio is just a fascinating place. Having grown up in the Bay Area and, having family in San Francisco, having studied in San Francisco, gone to the Presidio, et cetera, it's a really interesting, beautiful location. But I appreciate the conversation with you two today because you kind of peeled back layers that probably most of us don't know existed and really gave a portrait of a place that's connected to so many people and peoples and historical events. So I really appreciate that. And I encourage everybody who can, whenever you're in or near San Francisco, get to the Presidio, get to the Officers Club, which is now the museum that is a beautiful and well-done museum taking you through all of the different phases of the Presidio's life story. And just enjoy your time there. It's a great place to bring kids or anybody of any age. So, Rob and Kari, I really appreciate your taking the time, and I thank you so much.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code podcast, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.